Welcome to Science Update. This is a Facebook Live session where I take a look at the latest scientific discoveries and explore what they mean for the Christian faith. This week, we're going to take a look at a discovery that was published in a journal called The Frontiers of Psychology by 3 scientists from the US, Brazil, and Japan. And these scientists are interested in the question, when did language emerge in modern humans? And to answer this question, they take a rather interesting, novel approach by examining an unusual feature of cave art and rock art. And they conclude that language must have emerged rather early in human history. And in fact, the results that they present aligns with a biblical understanding of the nature of humanity and a biblical understanding of human origins. And I'm going to unpack this discovery in just a minute. But before I do that, I would like to ask everyone who's watching this broadcast to go ahead and take a moment, check in, say hi, let me know who you are and where you're watching from. This is valuable information for us to have as we plan future broadcasts. But again, it's a great way for me to get to know who you are. And I really enjoy finding out who's watching these broadcasts and trying to learn a little bit about each and every one of you. In fact, the last time we did a broadcast, which was last week, a number of you took the time to check in, including Timothy Kaywood from Stockton, California, Neil English from Scotland, Nancy Farrington Reed from Boston, Massachusetts, Michael Guthrie from Chesapeake, Virginia, Rachel Enns from Canada, Alan Ruppel from India, and Billy Grimes from Nashville, Tennessee. So thank you to all of you who took the time to check in. Please go ahead and check in for this week's broadcast. Also, take a moment and react to the broadcast with the like button. The more likes that we get, the more comments that we get, the greater the visibility the broadcast receives in the Facebook feed. So by reacting to the broadcast, you are actually helping to promote this message, to get this message out there. And then finally, I want to know what you think. Is there scientific evidence in your view that supports a biblical understanding of human origins and human nature? Or is an evolutionary explanation the best explanation to account for the origin and the nature of humanity? Is an evolutionary view of human origins compatible with the biblical faith, with the Christian faith? Yes or no, why or why not? Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and start unpacking this discovery. And as I mentioned, this research team was interested in trying to understand, when did language appear in modern humans? And of course, language is a reflection of a property that human beings possess, a property called symbolism, which is the ability to represent the world with discrete symbols, not only physical objects in the world, but also abstract ideas. And human beings have another capacity that is related to our capacity for symbolism, and that's an open-ended generative capacity that allows us to manipulate those symbols and embed concepts within concepts to help us develop cause and effect relationships, to project what the future is going to be, to reflect upon the past events, and to learn from those past events that can then be applied for future endeavors. This is a quality that defines human beings. Language is one aspect of symbolism, as is music, art, and body ornamentation or jewelry use. Now, these scientists are approaching this question, by the way, from an evolutionary perspective, and you'll see how that plays into the approach that they take to try to determine when language appears, again, which is a facet of our symbolic capacity. Now, I would actually argue that symbolism is a quality unique to human beings. However, this claim is disputed. Last week's broadcast, we took a look at the question, did Neanderthals make art? Because there are claims out there that Neanderthals made art, that Neanderthals made music, that Neanderthals had a capacity for symbolism, that Neanderthals have advanced cognitive abilities, that they would bury their dead ritualistically, that they mastered fire, that they would make use of plants for medicinal purposes, that they would care for the sick within their population group, and the list goes on and on. And yet, in each instance, these claims don't withstand scientific scrutiny. These claims have been disputed, as I discussed last week, with respect to Neanderthal art. And so it's not clear whether or not Neanderthals were capable of symbolic behavior. So this is, again, a disputed idea. And in fact, the researchers of this paper point out that, again, claims of Neanderthal symbolism seem to be largely suspect, that they are disputed. But then they argue that even if you grant that Neanderthals had some semblance of symbolic capacity, they follow that up by pointing this out, and I'm going to quote from the paper, that the human capacity for symbolic thinking is immeasurably greater and qualitatively distinct. In other words, these researchers point out that even if you grant that Neanderthals had some semblance of symbolic capability, it was nothing like what we see with modern humans. And again, this was a point that was made last week in the broadcast where we talked about the question of Neanderthal art. Now, there's other people who would have argued against Neanderthals having symbolic capacity, and one of them is Ian Tattersall. And his argument, as I mentioned last week, is that when you look at the rate of technical innovation, that rate of technical innovation is not there for Neanderthals. That Neanderthals had the same capacity for technology at the time that they appeared on the scene as when they disappeared from the earth, as when they went extinct. But yet modern humans show a very dramatic trajectory for technological innovation. They argue that can only make sense if human beings have not only symbolic capacity, but the capacity for language. And so as the researchers point out, that Tattersall would argue that this is the point where we should look for language appearing, because again, the problem is that language doesn't fossilize. So you have to infer language from other features of the archaeological record. So this is the feature that Tattersall argues, and he argues that this trajectory or the steep increase in technological innovation, that steep trajectory occurs at about 100,000 years ago. The authors point out that there's also archaeological evidence for symbolism that goes back to easily 70,000 years, maybe even earlier than that in the archaeological record, that this could be taken as a marker for the emergence of language. But language and symbolism are not necessarily one and the same, that just because humans are displaying evidence for symbolism doesn't mean we necessarily have the capacity for language. And so therein lies the problem that these researchers are trying to sort through. And so they suggest that maybe the cave art that is found not only in France and Spain and Germany, but also in Asia, may actually provide a clue as to when language emerged. Because, of course, this cave art is incredibly impressive, but it reflects human symbolic capabilities. And they also argue that there's cave art that the sand produced, rock art, not cave art, check that, rock art that the sand produced that's found in Africa that dates at about 70,000 years in age. And so they would argue again that because we see a distribution of cave art around the world, that including seeing cave art in Africa that goes back 70,000 years, that this suggests that art appears prior to the migration of humans into Europe and into Asia. And again, this could be taken as a marker for symbolism. But again, artistic expression isn't the same thing necessarily as language. Now, what these researchers point out is something rather remarkable about the cave art found in France and Spain, as well as in Asia, and the rock art produced by the sand. And that it's not just simply artistic expression that is represented by this cave art, but there's something else going on that's rather phenomenal. And by the way, this cave art is incredibly impressive. These cave art sites are, in many instances, dominated by these massive murals that are not only on the walls but on the ceilings. Many times that cave art is depicted in locations in the cave that would be exceedingly difficult to access. High ceilings, high walls. The size of the cave art depictions is massive in some cases. And what's being depicted in many instances are animals, hoofed animals like mammoths and horses and different types of deer, cattle, as well as carnivores, bears, hyenas, felines, and creatures like rhinos. We also see some depictions of humans, but the humans that are depicted are essentially stick figures, which is really odd because the art that's depicted for the animals is representative art. It's highly detailed, highly accurate in its depiction. So these humans had capacity to represent the world symbolically and representatively that Richard Koss, a psychologist who studies the origin of art, has argued that this is a reflection of the fact that we have a large parietal lobe as human beings that distinguishes us from Neanderthals, whose parietal lobe relative to ours is underdeveloped. Because the parietal lobe is the area of the brain that is involved in visual motor coordination. And he argues that that visual motor coordination is necessary to produce the types of representative art that you see in the caves. In addition to that, there's geometric images that are depicted, lines and dots, and these are arranged in geometric patterns. There's also positive and negative hand stencils that are produced in this cave art. So it's a rather wide range of items that constitutes the cave art. But what's interesting is that this cave art, again, is oftentimes located in very difficult to access regions in the cave. And sometimes, even within those regions, you'll see a clustering of the animals depicted in a particular region of the cave. And it is odd to researchers, it's odd to archaeologists as to why that cave art is depicted in that particular area. And there's a new area of study called archaeoacoustics, where people are measuring the acoustic properties of the caves in which humans and Neanderthals occupied. And what they've discovered is that the cave art corresponds to areas of the cave that have particular acoustical properties. So, for example, where the hoofed animals are depicted, they typically will be depicted in areas of the cave that when you have echoes and reverberations, depending on the sounds that you make, it actually sounds like the activity of hoofed animals. And it sounds like hoofed animals that are moving around. And if you go to areas of the cave where the felines are depicted, many times those areas are silent areas within the caves. And so scientists are believing now that the cave art is actually a cross-modal form of information where it's not just simply art, but it's also accompanying acoustical representations that they think reflects an understanding and a capacity for language. That is, this artwork is a multi-sensory experience, that not only is it the art that's being experienced, but sound that is also being depicted as those humans would have been in those areas of the caves and would have begun to make noises, chanting or calling out or making other types of sounds. They also point out that the rock art made by the sand, which is on the surface of rocks in Africa, has a similar type of cross-modal property, where the art is typically depicted on rocks, where if you're in that area and you make sounds, have an echoing sound going on. And according to David Lewis Williams, an archaeologist who has studied cave art and has offered an explanation for what's going on with this cave art, suggests that this is what the sand we're doing with this cave art, again with this cross-modal acoustical effect going on, was depicting what they thought to be a sense of a complex world that consisted of not only the physical realm, but a spiritual realm. And they thought that those echoes reflected essentially the spiritual activity that was underneath the surface of the rocks. That is, these very first humans had this sense that this world that we lived in consisted of a physical realm, a spiritual realm, and what happened in the spiritual realm influenced the physical realm. And David Lewis Williams argues that the cave art depicted in France and Spain, in Germany, and in different Asian countries reflects the activity of a shaman, reflects the vision that shaman would have had, that shaman would have gone into these caves and would have taken psychotropic agents, having visions that was an attempt on their part to communicate to the spiritual realm and to actually then to begin to access and influence that spiritual realm for the benefit of the people that that shaman represented, and that the cave art was presumably visions that the shaman would have had. And the argument is that the deeper you went into the earth, according to David Lewis Williams, the closer you would have been to that spirit realm, which again is, and that the walls of the cave actually were the veil between the physical realm and the spiritual realm. And so when you now look at the sand rock art, you see kind of a unifying purpose for why the sand were producing art on the surface of the rocks, and why these humans in Europe and Asia were producing art deep within the caves. That this was a deeply religious experience. In fact, the argument on David Lewis Williams' part is that the hand stencils were an attempt to try to communicate or connect on the part of people in the physical realm with the spiritual realm. So the point here is this, is that this artwork is reflecting some very sophisticated ideas that these first humans had about a complex world that they lived in, recognizing a spiritual reality, but it was also not only an artistic depiction, but also an acoustical reinforcement of what was being depicted on the art rocks, and those acoustical effects may have in their minds had deeply spiritual significance. And according to the authors of this paper, this is suggesting the capacity for language. Now, what's really interesting is that when you look at the genetic makeup of the human population structure, what we see is that humanity originates, about 100 to 150,000 years ago. And what we see when we look at the human genetic structure is that there are two branches that take place shortly after the emergence of humans. One is essentially a side branch that includes the San, and the other is a branch that would include the people that left Africa, that went into Europe, into Asia, that began to migrate around the world. And according to the authors of this paper, because we see now rock art depicted and also the cave art depicted that has, again, a unifying purpose, unifying characteristics, they argue that this property must have existed prior to the split of humanity into these two lineages, which pushes it very close to the time when humanity would have originated. And that, that these very first humans must have had the capacity for language because of this cross-modal transfer of information that's represented by the cave art. And they point out as well that the San communicate with a language known as clicking, and that clicking probably reflects some version of what was likely the very first language that human beings employed. But again, because that this split is very early in human history, it means that the humans that gave rise to those two branches must have had the capacity for language. So we see here, based on this assessment, that language looks as if it emerges very early in human history, coinciding with the time that modern humans would have appeared, coinciding with the time where human beings would have emerged, indicating that our symbolic capability and our capacity as behaviorally modern humans coincides very closely with the time when anatomically modern humans would have emerged, which is what I would expect from a biblical standpoint, that advanced sophisticated cognitive abilities in humans would coincide with the time in which we would have originated. Now, in my view, when we look at human beings and our advanced cognitive abilities or behavioral capacities, archaeologists try to describe those capacities that they think set us apart from other creatures using four concepts, two of which we already talked about: symbolism and open-ended generative capacity. They also argue that human beings are unique in that we have theory of mind. in that we recognize that other people have minds like ours, and so we can anticipate what other people are thinking and what other people are feeling, which allows us to form complex social interactions and motivates us to try to share symbolically what's going on in our minds. And we also have a capacity to form very complex, hierarchical, and nested social structures where we can keep track of people and assign people to different categories and different groupings with respect to relationship with ourselves. And when we put these four qualities together, this is what makes us unique and distinct as human beings. Now, it's very interesting because I would argue that these qualities that are being described scientifically are essentially the qualities that we would understand as Christians as reflecting the image of God. Now, I take a resemblance view of the image of God. We've done past broadcasts where we've talked about what is meant in Scripture by the notion of the image of God, and I think the most biblically robust view is a resemblance view that would argue that human beings have properties that resemble in part and imperfectly God himself. And so because God is a creator, we are many creators as well. And in order to be creators, we have to have a capacity for symbolism, for open-ended generative capacity. We have to have the ability to think rationally, to be able to be able to again represent the world in symbols that we can manipulate. And so the resemblance view would argue that as human beings, we have a capacity for rational thought. We have a capacity for language, for art, for music. We are creative. We have technical inventiveness. This view would also argue that we are moral creatures, where we have an inherent understanding of right and wrong and a desire for justice. It also argues that we are creatures that recognize that there is a reality beyond the material world, beyond the physical realm, and that we desire to connect to that. We have a desire to connect to that which is transcendent, which manifests itself in the form of religious expression and ritualistic burials. But even you could see this cave art as reflecting a desire to connect to the transcendence that is a desire for religious expression. And finally, we also have a capacity for relationship with God and relationship with other people. And so I would argue that what we're learning about cave art and the fact that this seems to be a property that's unique to humans is, again, in line with how the biblical text understands human nature, that we stand apart from all other creatures because we bear God's image. And that image of God coincides with the time in which we were created as human beings, again, in God's image. And this concept of the image of God is so critical to the Christian faith because it is the concept that underlies the fact that we believe every human being has inherent worth and value and dignity. It's because every human being possesses the image of God. And then on top of that, it's the image of God that allows us to relate to our Creator himself. And it's the image of God that's damaged, that's marred in the fall. And the original sin that we all suffer from is a reflection of the fall of Adam and Eve, a real fall that took place in space and time. And it's when we embrace the sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ on the cross that the image of God in us that is damaged now is restored, is transformed to be the true image of God that was created in Adam and Eve at the time that humanity was brought into existence through a Creator's handiwork. But it's because we bear God's image that it was worth Jesus Christ coming to live among us as fully God and fully human, manifesting the true image of God, that because we bear God's image, it was worth Christ dying on the cross, sacrificing himself for our sin. And so this paper that's published, again, to me, provides support for an idea that is so foundational to the Christian faith, that we are unique, that we are exceptional as human beings, and that exceptional nature relates to the fact that we bear God's image. And I would argue that try as people might to make the case that Neanderthals possessed symbolism, those attempts, in my view, are failing. And it's so sad that what is publicized so often are studies that make the claims that Neanderthals possess symbolism, but the myriad studies that refute those claims through robust scientific investigation, many times don't get the light of day, other than to be presented and buried deep within the scientific literature. But if you go to that literature and you look, you can see many examples where people have raised questions about Neanderthal symbolism. So in my view, human beings stand apart. We stand distinct from all other creatures in the way that Scripture describes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and bring things to a close. Thank you so much for watching. I would ask those of you who are watching the broadcast, take a moment, check in, let me know who you are, where you're watching from. For those of you who are watching this broadcast, take a moment and react to it with the like button. The more likes that we get, the greater the visibility we receive in the Facebook feed. And then also I want to know what you think about the origin of humanity. And until next time, I'm going to wrap things up by reminding you that the more that we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe. God bless you guys. See you next time.